Welcome to a special In Other News broadcast that will again engage in rigorous discussion of opposing viewpoints on geoengineering. I'm Geoff Brady. In this first hour, Dane Wigington will speak with author Patrick Wood, who researches the technocratic totalitarianism but consciously omits climate engineering within the belief that climate change data and concerns are not real, and that it's part of a multi-pronged scam. A scam imposed by entities such as the Trilateral Commission and the United Nations that set up the long game now known as Agenda 2030. Dane Wigington will counter with climate change and climate engineering evidence indicating climate change is real and that climate engineering has been fully deployed, further fueling an overall climate collapse. In the second hour, Professor Paul Beckwith returns for round two. Professor Beckwith explores the data showing rapidly changing weather patterns. Beckwith said he would look into Dane's research on real-time climate engineering, indicating that ongoing geoengineering programs are a major causal factor related to the accelerating climate disasters and disruptions. What is climate engineering or geoengineering? Some define it as the deliberate modification of a planet's environment by the addition or subtraction of a resource or energy input on a massive scale. Proposed geoengineering projects on Earth, often introduced as a means of combating climate change, have included space mirrors, aluminum or sulfur spraying in the stratosphere, and oceanic carbon sequestration. Our guest, Dane Wigington, has a background in solar energy and forestry. He's a former employee of Bechtel Power Corp. and is the lead researcher for geoengineeringwatch.org. Dane focuses on the climate engineering issue and claims available evidence indicates geoengineering has been fully deployed for decades with catastrophic effects. Dane, welcome back to the second live geoengineering discussion.
Thank you for having me back, Jeff. Thank you for continuing to revisit this issue, which, environmentally speaking, mathematically speaking, is the single greatest assault against the planet and the web of life at this time, short of nuclear cataclysm. So thank you for continuing to allow us to air the facts on this issue so people can decide for themselves the need to investigate and what is really going on in our skies.
Great. It's good to have you back, Dane. Patrick Wood is joining us as well. He's a leading and critical expert on sustainable development, green economy, agendas 21 and 2030, and the history of technocracy. He is the author of Technocracy Rising, the Trojan Horse of Global Transformation, and co-author of Trilaterals Over Washington's Volumes 1 and 2 with the late Anthony Sutton. Wood is a leading expert on the elitist Trilateral Commission and their policies and achievements in creating their self-proclaimed, quote, new international economic order, which is the essence of sustainable development on a global scale. Patrick, welcome to the discussion.
Well, thank you for having me on. I'm looking forward to the discussion.
Excellent. Well, there's no doubt there are many areas that you both would agree on, but we'll focus in on each viewpoint of climate change and real-time climate engineering. Patrick, you talk about technocracy as a replacement economic system, as wealth redistribution, and it's about controlling resources from city, state, and federal governments for a global trust. You've pointed out that the technocratic system was at one time outlawed in Canada. Well, if you would, please give listeners an understanding of what technocracy is and how you write about its influence in the context of its involvement in the climate change topic.
Well, you bet. The original technocrat movement started back in the 1930s when it was in the heat of the Great Depression. Scientists and engineers at Columbia University took it upon themselves to create a brand new economic model, a new system, if you will. It's a resource-based system that was going to be accounted for by energy. In other words, how much energy it took to make everything and distribute everything. And it was very radical. It didn't succeed. Fortunately, the American public rejected it mostly by the middle of the 40s. But they themselves said back in that day in one of their official publications that technocracy is the science of social engineering. And they said it's the scientific operation of the entire social mechanism to produce and distribute goods and services to the entire population. That was kind of the genesis of modern day, what they call sustainable development now today. And it's a new economic system that the United Nations has sworn to use to overthrow capitalism and free enterprise altogether. And one of the main means, how this ties into what we're talking about today, one of the main means to accomplish sustainable development is this whole area of global warming, which used to be global cooling back in the 70s, by the way, which that turned out to be a pretty big joke, but they flip-flopped and said, nope, it's global warming, not global cooling. So the whole mantra over the last several years that we've seen in the public eye, including the big Paris Climate Agreement, stuff like that, this whole thing has, in my opinion, and according to what I see in technocracy documents, is basically the stimulus to drive people into the only solution being offered, namely sustainable development or technocracy. So around this topic of climate change or global warming, whichever side you want to take on it, cooling, warming, whatever, there has risen up an industry, mostly driven by scientists and engineers, to fiddle with the atmosphere. And this is where the rub comes in, of course. Do we want people fiddling with the atmosphere? I say no. I think most people would say no. We like the air we breathe, just the way it is, just the way it comes to us from Mother Nature. We don't need any help. But there are a number of actors today that are doing different things with the atmosphere, not just necessarily with airplanes, by the way, but there's other things as well. This whole topic, this whole kind of scientific area of managing global warming includes geoengineering. It's a very important segment of it now. And we find very openly that there are, in fact, scientists and engineers all over the world that are doing things to our atmosphere in order to control the weather. And yes, it is having adverse effects. And I would say if there is man-made climate change, I would say a hearty amen.
Okay, Patrick or Geoff, before we get too far, I'm just afraid if we get too far down the road, I won't be able to catch up to...
that's true, Dane. And okay, so thank you, Patrick. Dane, could you give listeners your views on climate change and climate engineering and then respond to Patrick's perspective, please?
For the listeners still that don't know why I'm in this endeavor, I have a background in solar energy, again with Bechtel Power. Home was on the world's largest renewable energy magazine, Off-Grid Home. I was losing tremendous amounts of solar uptake from whatever the aircraft were emitting over my head. That's what led me onto the subject of climate engineering. Back to, in regards to the state of the climate, Patrick mentioned something important that needs to be considered. He mentioned the fact that there was a very anomalous leveling off of global temperatures between 1945 and about 1975. The part of the equation that is never admitted to is that was the direct result of the early deployment of climate engineering, which happened based on available data in 1945. So without an open admission of this fact, we had academicians that didn't understand, and the geoengineering was first deployed over the polar regions, had a profound effect until the negative effects were fully manifest, if you will. So this gap that people who deny anything is wrong with the climate, and Patrick, you and I would agree on many points, the sort of criminal elements in government, their plans, their agendas, we would agree on many points in that regard. But I think it's important to note that the notion that there is nothing wrong with the climate is actually a parroting of the exact narrative the power structure wants. And when we look at an issue like you mentioned, that there was a big joke on the cooling that happened from 1945 to 75, or leveling off of the temperatures, I would counter that with, it's definitely not a joke. That was the deployment from an experiment from which there is no return of climate engineering. And unless or until we include climate engineering in that equation, we're not having a legitimate discussion. So that leveling off of temperatures, some of which may have been simply due to statistical altering of the data to make it look as if geoengineering was truly having a more profound effect to help sell it to other nations. So again, I would argue we can't have a legitimate discussion about the climate without discussing climate engineering first and foremost. And as you correctly stated, Patrick, I think you would more or less would agree if you can acknowledge this, that the climate engineering programs are having an effect on the climate. I think you kind of agreed to that. Is that correct?
That's absolutely correct. And whether it's having a tangible effect right now, or whether they want it to have a tangible effect, those might be two topics to talk about. But there is intent there. There's definitely intent there.
Okay, so if those types of operations have an effect on the climate, what I would argue is, why would we not consider any other form of human activity that has a similar impact on the energy balance of the planet? Why would that not also affect the climate? So, any form of human activity that affects the energy balance of the planet is, in fact, a form of geoengineering. So this cooling period you spoke of, data indicates, is a direct result of climate engineering, and as the negative aspects truly kicked in about the mid-'70s, the military-industrial complex just doubled down again and again and again. And I would argue this, and I'll toss this mic back to you and Geoff, that the exact narrative, the power structure and the climate engineers want the public to parrot, is that there's nothing wrong with the climate. That's one of the primary objectives of the climate engineers. So to take that narrative is actually to toe the line for the power structure and the geoengineers.
Patrick, your response?
Well, yeah, that's an interesting thought. At this point, if I were let's say a hardcore climatologist, climate scientist, and I looked up one day, I just woke up maybe like Rip Van Winkle and looked up at the whole situation with the atmosphere and what's going on and whatever, and tried to make sense out of what's actually happening and how much was done by the right hand, how much was done by the left hand. I don't think at this point anybody can really say what the baseline is for the climate, except maybe going back 500 years. I don't know that anybody can say what the baseline is right now, because so many people have been mucking it up in all kinds of ways, whether it be smoggy cities like Beijing, or whether it be volcanoes, or whether it be spraying stuff, putting stuff, or injecting stuff into the atmosphere to create artificial cloud cover. I don't know how you can separate the whole thing at this point and say, well, this is 20% here, 5% there, and so on. It's a mess. The whole thing is a mess. And basically, my position is, if I could have my way, all this stuff just needs to stop. Period. We need to take the reins away from anybody who would attempt to artificially change the atmosphere. Period.
We would certainly agree on that point. What I would argue is this, and that's certainly the mission of geoengineeringwatch.org, to expose and halt climate engineering. But why would we not consider any sort of particle emitted in the atmosphere, whether it's from a smokestack or the back of a jet aircraft, to not have the same effect? The atmosphere certainly doesn't know the difference between the two. In either case, there's an energy balance impact on the planet. And when we know that we have a military-industrial complex that wants desperately to keep business as usual, and in order to do that, a significant percentage of the population must be convinced that there's nothing suicidal about business as usual. And back to the geoengineers and creating short-term, highly toxic regional cooldowns to skew the data and make headlines in certain arenas. Even with that, we have, for the record, Patrick, we just passed May 2018 was the 399th consecutive month of above normal temperatures, 399 months in a row, 41 years in a row. And of all the things in the atmosphere that you described are certainly all affecting the atmosphere. It would be, as you correctly stated, difficult if not impossible to quantify which was having specific percentage effect compared to other effects. But we can say that all those elements are, in fact, anthropogenic. They're human-caused. Whether it's cutting down the forests, spraying the atmosphere with reflective particulates as part of solar radiation management, the belching of 100 million tons of CO2 in the atmosphere every single day, all of those are related to human activity. So when you say shut things down, would you infer that then everything that's affecting the energy balance of the planet should be shut down, or only climate engineering?
I would say first that this is what we're focusing on right now. I would say first that climate engineering, that is artificial climate engineering, should be, even if not completely shut down, should be regulated in such a way that people cannot just go and do what they want to do without any transparency or any accountability like it is today. And this is one reason we see our skies crisscrossed with trails behind airplanes that turn into clouds. That you start out with a beautiful day and you end up with a cloudy, overcast day. It's absolutely ridiculous. Anybody can look up at the sky and see there's something wrong. This kind of stuff is absolutely insane in my mind. We should stop this kind of stuff. Whatever it is, we should stop it. China just announced a program in Tibet where they're blanketing Tibet with massive rain-making machines that are injecting particulates and stuff into the sky to drop rain over into China. This is a huge project. They're scattering these things, tens of thousands of these things, across the entire Tibetan landscape to create rain in China. Well, you know what? This stuff happens all over the world. It's happening in America right now. That's just as wrong as flying airplanes, in my opinion. Leave the stinking weather alone. And, if it rains in one place, fine, leave it alone. But when somebody starts to manipulate the weather in one area, it bumps the weather in another area and could cause, in some cases has, very serious impact on the other area. And at this point, nobody really knows what's going on because they're not paying attention to this. But we see dislocations in weather in some areas is caused, if you look at it hard enough, it's caused by some event, man-made event, in some other area. Sometimes it's absolutely on purpose, too, like they're doing in China right now, these rain-making machines.
Patrick, I want to clarify a couple of things. One is you do criticize the framing of climate change by the technocrats, and I understood that you didn't think that deliberate climate engineering, is being deployed right now. Could you clarify your position right there?
Oh, I can. It absolutely is being deployed. And as Dane mentioned, climate engineering goes way back into the last century, certainly before 1940. People, at least back then, were talking about it. But the military especially has been big on weather modification to use it as a military weapon, against an enemy. But civilians have gotten involved in this as well. And geoengineering started even before anybody was talking about global warming or anything else for that matter. They're just talking about modifying the climate for whatever reason they wanted to. This is a typical technocrat mindset, by the way. If you can do it, you should do it. I don't agree with that, but they did. They were doing stuff even back in the 40s that would just drop your jaw today if you went back and read what they were doing. This kind of the same stuff we see today, and it is very closely tied in one sense to the military-industrial complex, and involves all sorts of things. Not just the chemtrail concept or meme that is easily visible in the sky, but there's so much more to the whole area of geoengineering than just flying chemicals into the sky with airplanes.
So if I could respond before we get too far, Patrick, you would agree then, I think, if I'm hearing you correctly, that we really can't have a legitimate discussion about the climate or the state of the climate without including climate engineering. Would that be correct?
Absolutely.
So
That's right.
What I would like to point out is when the leveling off of temperatures from 1945 to 1975 is referred to as proof that the climate system wasn't warming, and this is often referred to by those who unfortunately want to take the position that the power structure and the climate engineers want, that global warming is a hoax. And I think that's a position you've taken, if I understand from your previous disseminations. How can we take that position when, one, the data doesn't support that position, and two, when climate engineering has been going on the entire time, how can that not be a consideration? And as you did correctly state, it has been going on that long. And in regard to knowing the planet was warming, it was absolutely known in the 40s. There's data to back that up. We have Popular Science magazines here from that era acknowledging a 2 degrees C warming at that time. And in fact, global temperature maps reflect almost a straight-up trajectory in global temperatures up to 1945. And suddenly, unexplainably, the temperatures level off when climate engineering appears to have been fully deployed immediately after World War II. What I'm saying is this: how can we have any legitimate discussion about the state of the climate without including climate engineering? And even including climate engineering, all statistics indicate, and even our readings on the ground, Patrick, indicate that not only is it warming, we appear to be in what would be correctly categorized as an abrupt climate collapse, an abrupt climate shift. And what we see in the ground is not an underreporting of temperatures, as so many would like to believe, because they would like to believe there's nothing wrong with putting 100 million tons of CO2 in the atmosphere a day, or cutting down the forests, or poisoning the oceans. But what we see is an underreporting of temperatures, not overreporting. So it's in fact, it's much warmer than is actually being reported. And again, an expressed agenda of climate engineering, and on the whole concept of the agenda of those in power, we'd have many, many points we would agree on. But I would simply ask you to consider this, that a primary objective of not just of climate engineering, but of the power structure as a whole, is to mask the severity of abrupt climate collapse from the population until the last possible moment. And that is a primary objective that I feel is not being acknowledged.
I don't know that I have a whole lot to say about that. I would generally disagree with the meme that climate change, that global warming especially, is something that would have happened, that would have been brought to the attention of scientists normally, were it not for the global elite's intervention to use the concept of climate change as a driver to drive people towards sustainable development. This has been what the United Nations has done with it since at least 1974. Although back in those days, I'll point out, the big thing was global cooling, and
I think I just covered that.
The global elite back then.
Well, I answered that question.
No, I didn't push it. I never brought that into evidence, by the way. So I never said anything about the temperatures back in the 40s and 50s.
I misunderstood you. That maybe if I could clarify on that point, I thought you brought up the fact that I think you said it was a big joke because there was a cooling from 45 to 75, and I did try to answer that question. It relates directly to climate engineering, but maybe I misunderstood you.
Okay. No, that's not. Actually, I just didn't bring up any other temperature reference back in those days. But I just will point out that back in the early 70s, global cooling was the big thing, and Time magazine and Newsweek magazine were writing about it, and even the global elite were talking about it in terms of using that to drive people to a certain social outcome. This is about, and this is all definitely about moving people to a predetermined social outcome. And when I read the definition of technocracy in the first place, it's the science of social engineering. This is all of this boils down to that in the end, the science of social engineering. It's about what one group of people wants another group of people to do. And they're using science in order to accomplish that, to bully, if you will, to get their way and have people act in a certain way or consume in a certain way or live in a certain place or whatever. This I reject actually completely.
If I could respond to that, then you would agree that the climate engineering operations in some sense are a form of profiteering or agenda fulfillment by the power structure. Is that correct?
Well, there's another group of actors in the world, which I'm trying to, maybe I'm not making it very clear. There's another group of actors in the world that are not political. They're not political animals like we think of the traditional political
I don't want to open up a whole new, I want to finish that thought before we go into a whole new trajectory. I'm just trying to figure out that particular point. Forgive me, I just want to finish this point, then I'll give this back to you. But you mentioned the climate scenario being used simply as to fulfill an agenda, some form of, I would assume, profiteering or power structure grab, like wars, for example. I would point out that wars obviously are used for power structure purposes, for profiteering, but does that mean the wars didn't happen? Does that mean people didn't die? And the answer, of course, is no. And again, back to the global cooling mantra that was echoed in the 70s, again, a direct result of climate engineering. So how can we have a legitimate conversation about that narrative without including climate engineering? And the agendas of those in power, which I do not deny there are many dark agendas going on, but I would argue, will those agendas mean anything on a planet that doesn't support life? And let me end with this question. Do you feel that, environmentally speaking, the human race faces an existential threat from biosphere collapse at this point?
I do not. I would say no.
Can you give me anything to back that up? Anything, the basis for your conclusion on that?
Well, number one, the Earth's atmosphere has fluctuated all over the place over the millennia. And yet, for all the population, whatever population has been on planet Earth, we have survived. The atmosphere is incredibly resilient. It's made to, in my opinion, it was made and created to support life on planet Earth. It's very resilient in what it can heal from if there are dislocations. And there have been disasters throughout history that we can point to, like major volcanoes that erupted that virtually covered the world with ash and sent the world into a freezing frenzy, a deep freeze. But and there's been meteors that have hit the Earth. Even those types of things, the Earth has recovered from. It's done very well. I don't believe personally that I do believe if you take away all the geoengineering things, if somehow just wipe it away with the magic wand, so it doesn't exist and it hasn't existed. And here we are with the weather. Just we have a clean slate on the weather, and we look back historically without any other intervention. I would say that the weather goes up and down. Indeed, it changes. It changes mostly according to sunspots, not according to CO2 in the atmosphere, which is a greenhouse gas, by the way, not a toxic gas by any means. But the sun has been demonstrated many times to be the primary determinant of weather on planet Earth. And this has been much greater than any type of human involvement or human interaction with pollution and stuff that's put in the sky. Now, is it right to pollute? No, it's not. Is it right to have nasty, stinking smokestacks and stuff flowing into sewers that would kill cockroaches? No, absolutely not. It's not right. But that's just not right because it's not right. We certainly should make any attempt we can to be good stewards of the atmosphere. But has man been somehow evilly, complicit in destroying the atmosphere? I say no.
So, are you aware, Patrick, that in regard to fluctuations on the planet, which certainly we know we've had natural cycles, but are you aware that statistically speaking, the current rate of change is conservatively 170 times faster than any previous fluctuation on the planet? That's statistical fact, not disputed. But we are in the sixth great mass extinction right now. Were you aware of those 2 points?
No, I'm not. I don't accept them. I've heard them. I've heard the arguments, but I don't accept them.
I would ask listeners to actually look them up, because I think if we're really to get at the facts here, we need to work from a basis of facts, verifiable facts, and not what we would like to believe, what we wish was so. The species extinction rate right now, Patrick, is 200 to 300 per day, plant, animal, and insect. We've lost 60% plus of diverse wildlife populations in the last 40 years. Do you not see that as an existential threat?
I'll say again that the Earth has been very resilient to things that have been thrown at it, disasters or other events that cause things to happen. We don't have dinosaurs, for instance, right now, at least not big ones. And yes, there have been some insects, animals, birds, and so on that have become extinct. But there have been species becoming extinct for a very long time, and you can't lay all of that today at the feet of man, I don't think. Now, that doesn't mean that we shouldn't make some effort, perhaps, to keep some species from not going extinct, whether it's our fault or not. Just because we're humans, it's our Earth, and we like it, and why not keep those species around if we can? But to blame man for it, and to say, well, man has to do something to discipline himself or punish himself for what he's done to the planet, I don't go that far.
Dane, can you talk about your background in forestry and what you've observed and documented regarding the health of forests and what's raining down from what many believe is from particulates raining out from the atmospheric aerosol operations?
My father was an arborist, and that's what I did in my youth with him. And I've done, I've done 6 major habitat restoration programs with agency assistance to restore habitat in Northern California. I live in the wilderness. I've spent my life here, and the tree die-off rate, for example, if I can tie this into what Patrick stated, that we would not lay this at the hand of human activity. Since the dawn of civilization, we've lost 3.4 trillion trees. That's 55% of Earth's tree cover. 55%, and the other 45% is in very ill health. In regards to the species extinction rate, Patrick, the current rate, as compared to pre-civilization, it's 15,000 times more than the background rate. That's 1.5 million% of normal. So, yes, we've had species extinctions in the past, but we are at 1.5 million% of normal, 15,000 times the background rate. Statistically speaking, and there is a study, I encourage your listeners to look up everything I'm stating because all of this is verifiable, easily found online. Statistically speaking, the mathematical statistical odds of these changes not being anthropogenic in nature, i.e. human caused, is 100,000 to 1. Virtual certainty that the changes we see are human activity. And I would argue to try to conclude otherwise would be to, as an example I've used before, if you run someone over in a crosswalk or you throw them off of a building and try to make the argument that they died of a heart attack. It wasn't what you did. So I think it's imperative that we recognize human activity, and I'm focused on climate engineering, and I think Patrick and I would agree on that, but I'm simply stating if we take the narrative that human activity, military-industrial complex, fossil fuel industry has not decimated the planet, we are taking exactly the narrative the power structure wants to use to pacify and divide the population, to keep them distracted to the last possible moment. One question, and I'll toss it to you, Patrick. Patrick, you did mention CO2 as a gas of life, a greenhouse gas, was what you stated. Do you believe, then, that CO2 or greenhouse gases are what allows the planet to retain enough warmth for us to be here?
Do I believe that CO2 is why we're here?
The CO2 as a greenhouse gas, as you stated, was a greenhouse gas. Would I be correct in saying that you would agree that the greenhouse gases, in this case we're discussing CO2, are what allows the planet to retain enough heat for us to exist here?
No, I wouldn't necessarily say that, but I will say that CO2 is a gas that, well, let me give you an example. I grew up in Northern California on a ranch, on a farm. And in Woodland, California, a group of forward-looking agronomists invented hothouse farming of tomatoes. And they built these Quonset hut, large Quonset hut buildings with plexiglass on the top so light could get in, sunlight. And the first thing they did with these is they set up the beds of tomatoes inside with just fed by water and nutrients and so on. They installed CO2 concentrators at the end of the units, and they blew it with a big fans into the hothouse so they could increase the CO2 level in that hothouse. The result was the plants grew like crazy, just insanely crazy. The tomatoes they produced were just crazy. And nobody ever died working. No worker in those greenhouses ever died from too much CO2. It didn't have that effect whatsoever. Agriculture produce just went absolutely nuts. And historically, we can see, if we look back at the CO2 record in history, we can see how agriculture fared with different levels of CO2 in the atmosphere. The record shows the more CO2 we had, the higher the agricultural output. So if you want to lower agricultural output in the world, all you got to do is just drop the CO2 level, and it will automatically go down because it's a necessary gas for photosynthesis to take place.
If I could address that before we get too far, then, and so you would state then what is regulating the Earth's temperature? If it's not greenhouse gases, what system retains the Earth's heat if it's not greenhouse gases?
The sun puts the heat into the atmosphere.
But what retains it, though?
It.
What retains it? I mean, without an atmosphere, without greenhouse gases, we would resemble the planet like those that fry during the sun exposure and freeze without it. We have a temperature regulating blanket on the planet. I mean, I'm just trying to figure out what you think regulates that temperature. Again, without the greenhouse gases, we would fry during the day and freeze at night, every day, every night. I'm trying to understand what you think is regulating Earth's temperatures, if not greenhouse gases.
Well, I'm sure it's a very complex. The atmosphere is a very complex mechanism for sure. And I'm not an atmospheric scientist, but I don't want to even pretend that I am. But just the common sense of it is, to me, just the common sense of it is, the atmosphere that we've had has definitely changed to some extent over the millennia. You know, it's gone through cycles and so on. But the primary determinant of the amount of heat that gets into the atmosphere in the first place and heats the Earth is the sun. Without the sun, we have no heat at all. This is where heat comes from. If we have a very active sun and it's putting out an extra amount of radiation and so on, the Earth's atmosphere is going to heat, and vice versa. If the sun goes cool, if it like right now we're headed into a solar minimum, and so the Earth is probably going to go into a cooling cycle for a time. But this has been observed throughout history. So, you got two things. Where does the source of heat come from in the first place? Primary determinant is the sun, not how much we hold in with, man-made gases or anything else. It's still the sun.
I just want to point out, without greenhouse gases, the second the sun wasn't shining on the surface, the heat would immediately escape into space and the planet would freeze. So I don't think scientifically anyone disputes that we have an atmosphere that holds in the heat, and we have other gases that are not discussed, like methane, nitrous oxide, both of which are also filling the atmosphere, both of which are highly effective at trapping heat. And we see temperatures reflecting that. Although you stated you think we were heading into a cooling cycle, and I've heard that for about 10 years or 15 years from various sources, I refer back to the statistics that are not disputed. 41 years in a row of above normal global temperatures that are escalating rapidly still. 399 months in a row of above normal temperatures. In regard to CO2 and the hothouses, those environments do not use natural soils. They are heavily augmented soils, which allows those organisms to utilize the extra CO2. That is not the case in the natural world. In fact, we have peer-reviewed study to prove, I'm quoting right now, rising atmospheric CO2 is reducing protein concentration in pollen. It's reducing crop yields, not augmenting them in the natural world. It's reducing them. Why? Because nothing can adapt at this rate, at 170 times faster than any former fluctuation in Earth's climate. Nothing can adapt. And again, we are seeing, as a reflection of the greenhouse gases, and this is a big confirmation of this fact, we are seeing nighttime low temperatures rise twice as fast as daytime highs. Why? Because the heat is not escaping back at night as it once did, because the greenhouse gas effect is magnifying. And I would encourage listeners to investigate everything I'm stating. And back to climate engineering, which I think you and I definitely agree needs to stop, Patrick. My point is that if climate engineering is not discussed, brought into the open, and acknowledged, that engineered cool-down events, which are used to augment the argument that the planet is having fluctuations in the direction of cold as well, those events are completely engineered. Patrick, have you heard of a process, and we have patents to back up this process, called chemical ice nucleation for weather modification, the spraying of endothermic reacting materials into atmospheric moisture that creates a chemically induced cool down at the surface? Have you heard of, or are you familiar with these processes?
I have read about it, yes.
So would you not, would you consider or acknowledge that when they can engineer such an event and create a few record colds on the ground, that there must be an agenda behind them doing so, would there not be? And is that agenda, would we be rational to believe that agenda, part of that agenda, is to, again, create confusion and division in the population in regard to the true state of climate collapse, biosphere collapse, to keep the population, again, confused and divided until the last possible moment, when they can engineer winter, literally?
I would not jump to that conclusion, nor to the motive that the idea is to manipulate people in the way that you're describing. It may.
What would you say the motive would be?
Well, I've already said that the motive of this whole social engineering program is to move people into sustainable development. That's the big plan that that this whole thing, that this whole idea of global warming and climate change has been put forth in the first place by the United Nations. And they're looking to implement sustainable development. Sustainable development is warmed over technocracy from the 1930s. I'm telling you, it's an ugly system that tells business people what they're allowed to make and tells consumers what they're allowed to consume. I am absolutely against that type of micromanagement of people and society. And that's where all this thing is leading, because when you get down to it, whatever the thing is, when you get down to it and say, well, if man has been the one that's done all this, then we need to regulate and modify man to make man not do this anymore. So you're down to social engineering again. I disagree completely with social engineering, and I think people just need to stay out of it. And but there's always been people who want to lord it over other groups of people throughout history. That's nothing new. So when the scientists got involved, let me finish my thought. When the scientists got involved with this whole process, when the scientists and engineers got involved, like the ones that were at Columbia University back in 1932 that started Technocracy, when they got involved, everything they said, everything had a scientific solution. There was no truth to be found outside of science, period, end of subject. And so the scientific method would be the final arbiter of all wisdom and knowledge that would come through these scientists and engineers. So every problem that happens to mankind, they rise up and say there's a scientific solution. This is wrong thinking. There's plenty of truth discovered outside of the laboratory or outside of science. And, to say that that's the only source of truth is just flat out wrong. But you give a technocrat scientist or engineer some rope. The first thing he'll do is look for a problem to solve, and he'll have some scientific explanation on how it can be solved. This is largely the mindset that has brought us the current round of geoengineering. This is the way these people think. And it's wrong-headed, but that's the way they think.
I would completely agree with you on those points, that this is the techno-fix mentality that's heaping one layer of insanity on top of another, on top of another. On the other hand, the notion that we should all have free reign as groups or individuals to do whatever we want, wherever we want, whenever we want, like groups like Raytheon, Lockheed Martin, and others in the military-industrial complex that are, in fact, at the core of climate engineering, and the notion that they should not be regulated or overseen or restricted in any way is why we're in this mess. If we all simply behaved in a manner that had no regard for the long-term greater good, we wouldn't be here long, and in fact, that's exactly the path we are on right now. So, again, in regard to greenhouse gas buildup, the effect on crop production, which is well documented, can't augment crop production. Excess CO2 cannot augment crop production without enough supporting elements in the soils, and those are not there, and it's in fact decreasing the nutrient content of many crops. We have the notion that all of us doing whatever we want. I, for example, have a significant habitat preserve on the east side of Lake Shasta. If I decided to cut every tree down on my preserve, would that not have ramifications for those around us? And if we're doing things as individuals that impact others around us, that is a direct contradiction to the sort of scenario I think you laid out, where we should all be free to do whatever we want. But if what we or corporations are doing is horrifically and permanently in many ways impacting others, do you not see a problem with that?
Corporations are at the root of this from the get-go. That's why I studied the Trilateral Commission back in the 1970s. They were the group that represented most of the largest multinational corporations of that day, and they set out for a plan to create a new international economic order. That was all over their literature back then. This is a result today. This is a result of that new international economic order that they started to plow the ground for back in 1973. It was fueled by these very large organizations, including one of the early engineering organizations, by the way, that belonged to the Trilateral Commission was Bechtel Engineering. Caspar Weinberger was one of the founding members of the Trilateral Commission.
That's why I left
in one
early age. I made that clear. I mean, I've had that hung around my neck. I left when I was 22 years old because of what I saw. There's not much else I can do but leave a company like that. So you would say that regulation is necessary for those that are behaving badly, for who are damaging the planet on which our lives depend. You would say regulation is necessary. Is that correct?
I would. And listen, I want to say that the United Nations and all their literature and all these, the purists, if you will, that say that sustainable development is good for us, they say they're going to save the world. The United Nations, their 17 sustainable development goals start out with eliminate poverty throughout the world. Well, who's against, who wouldn't want to be for that? They want to have jobs for all. They want education, lifelong education opportunities. Those are all great utopian-sounding goals. But while these people are leading with the concept of, hey, we're going to save the world, aren't you happy that we're going to save the world? The fact of the matter is, their actions, okay, I don't care what comes out of their mouth, their actions are polar opposite of their mouth. They're doing things and enacting policies that will destroy the earth, not save it.
I would agree with that. I'm just trying to figure out the contradiction between what I understand your statement to be, that we should not have certain restrictions placed on us, but yet in another vein it seems that you recognize the problem with that. And we have individuals running corporations, of course, all looking out for their own interests. And I would argue the human race at this point is behaving like a cancer, that each cell of which is looking out for its own interest and very few considering the overall ramifications. And if I can tie this back into, again, the CO2, which I know I heard you on one interview state the more the better you felt, and I've expressed on the crop loss and so forth, and the negative effect that the excess CO2 is absolutely having. What are your thoughts about the acidification of the oceans and the excess CO2 that is wreaking havoc? The absorption of the CO2 in the oceans is wreaking havoc on aquatic ecosystems. What are your thoughts about that?
What could I say about it? I mean, okay, so the oceans are changing like the atmosphere changes. It's had cycles and stuff as well. There's lots of stuff about the ocean right now I don't like, but there's also a lot of hysteria I believe is absolutely false. And what I would really like to see ultimately are some scientists who are not polluted themselves by grants from organizations who are asking specific questions that have nothing to do with real science, really. I'd like to see some people, a group of people or just a bunch of people, study what's really going on without some predetermined agenda. We don't have that today. Everybody that's studying these things has a predetermined agenda, what they're doing. You look at the climate data and stuff that's been consistently found to be fraudulent. It's like, okay, why is it fraudulent? Why does the data have to be manipulated in order to prove your preconceived idea? Well, they do it. They've done it. The government's done it. Private organizations, universities have done it, and they've been caught doing it. To me, this is just a waste. A waste of time. This is just typical of mankind covering his own butt and moving to a political agenda that has nothing to do with his discipline, that is scientific discipline.
If I can
remove that.
Okay, go ahead. I'm sorry. Go ahead, Patrick.
We say we need to remove that skew and let people just do their science that they're trained to do without forcing them into a box where they have to come to some conclusion that fits somebody's political agenda.
In regard to the climate data, I would agree with you. There's been massive falsification, but in the opposite direction of what many would choose to believe. The state of the climate is exponentially worse and more dire than any official agency reports. And we've stated this at geoengineeringwatch.org for nearly a decade. I stated it long before that. We now have increasing studies coming out, daily, weekly, that in fact what's unfolding is worse than the worst case scenario previously predicted. So we are actually, as you said, measuring in the field. That's exactly what we are doing. And all we see, as I stated earlier in this broadcast, is an under-reporting of temperatures, not over-reporting. And when we refer to two scientists at East Anglia University, which is a common premise given for the excuse that all climate data is falsified to the upside, which is not true. That's a very small example compared to the rest of the study we have, which is not disputed. And in regard to the heating of the planet, again, not disputed. 399 consecutive months in a row, 41 years in a row. In regards to cycles of the ocean, Patrick, I would argue again, whatever cycles occur naturally, when we have done what we have done to the planet, decimating well over half the trees, putting 100 million tons of CO2 in the atmosphere a day, paving the planet, poisoning the oceans. How can there not be an effect? We have a pelagic fish population. I'll give you hard statistics instead of just an opinion. Global pelagic fish population is down about 90%. Salmon populations, West Coast U.S., completely collapsed. Bluefin tuna populations down 97%. These are hard statistics. Global plankton populations down 60%. No plankton, no people. No trees, no people. No functional atmosphere, no people. So, again, at the current rate of extinction, at the current rate of species die-off, we are not going to be here much longer. And my point is, if you're advocating for business as usual, aside from climate engineering, which I think we agree on, I would argue that is one of the main objectives of the climate engineers, is to continue this debate about heating, cooling, cycles, so forth, when what we've done to the planet absolutely cannot be in any way, shape, or form, as I've already answered statistically, considered a natural cycle, 100,000 to 1, statistically. And your listeners can look this up, Geoff. So I'll finish with this. You say it's just hysteria, like the sort of data I'm giving is hysteria. Can you cite any example or any statistic that would back up the notion that a concern over biosphere collapse and planetary omnicide is just hysteria?
I don't have any statistic at my fingertips or at my lips that I can offer you, and I generally will say I don't argue by statistics anyway, because statistics can be completely misleading. And but I will say the Earth has been here for thousands of years, if not way longer. It's been doing great, up and down for sure. And the hysteria that people are saying, putting out there right now, okay, people have a right to be hysterical about stuff. I'm not saying they don't. But is the answer to punish mankind? Is or men individually? Is the answer to reduce the population so you simply don't have as much CO2 produced? Because certainly if people don't breathe, they won't produce CO2, and their economic activity will not produce CO2. So some people have concluded in the United Nations movement, for instance, that the Earth really can only handle a population somewhere maybe around 800 million people. Is this kind of the gist of what where your argument will go?
It's not up to me to determine how many people should be on the planet, but what I'm trying to acknowledge is that if we ignore the damage we've done to the planet, and if we pretend that human activity has had no effect, if we pretend that we're not in the sixth great mass extinction, not beginning into it, but well into it, again, having already lost in 40 years, we've lost 60% of Earth's wildlife population. In fact, let me put this into a little clearer statistic. If we overlay the Earth's time frame of 4.5 billion years over the span of a week, follow me with this analogy, it'll make more sense. The human race has done what it's done to the planet in 1/40th of a second before midnight on the last day. Each day would be 660 million years if we overlay a 4.5 billion year time frame over a week. We've done what we've done in 1/40th of a second before midnight on the last day. How could anyone think that this trend could continue, given the statistics I've just given you, the die-off of global plankton, without which we die, the trees, without which we die, the 170 times any previous event increase or in changes on the planet, species extinction rate of 1.5 million of normal? Is it rational to think we could continue on this course?
If you put all those facts, put all that data before somebody and say, assuming these things are true, what would be your conclusion? They'd probably come to the same conclusion that you're coming to now. Probably. But you remember Paul Ehrlich that wrote the famous book Population Bomb back in the late 60s. Paul Ehrlich predicted that the population of the Earth was going to basically extinguish the Earth. He said we're breeding more human beings, and that the population is going to grow. We're going to be elbow to elbow, and that it's going to basically end up destroying life on planet Earth. Paul Ehrlich was an entomologist that made that prediction. He was a bug scientist. He had no particular scientific credentials to write that book, but he applied his entomology science to the science of human reproduction and concluded that the world is going to populate itself to death, basically, and we'll all starve to death. Not one prediction that Paul Ehrlich ever made back in those days. His book sold millions of copies around the world, was translated into, I think, 50 or 60 languages. It's an incredibly popular book, and is still incredibly popular today. There's never been one single prediction that Paul Ehrlich made in that book that has come true, even closely true. Yet it had a big impact on people back then, and is still being used to have an impact on people today.
Dane.
That kind of hysteria does not result in anything necessarily being predictive on what's going to happen in the future. He was dead wrong. And there's been other people dead wrong in other scientific areas where they claim there's going to be some cataclysmic event or whatever that's, collapse or whatever, that's going to change the face of the planet Earth. Well, maybe it will, maybe it won't. It's not given to man to know the future. And, Paul Ehrlich is just a classic example of somebody who misused science to come to a conclusion that was just absolutely false.
Dane, before you answer that, I just wanted to let you guys know we have about 4 minutes left, and I thought, Dane, it might be important to talk about the temperature map that you mentioned to me to create a business as usual scenario regarding climate, using climate engineering, especially over the northeast part of the United States.
I would encourage your listeners to look, Geoff, at if they search geoengineeringwatch.org for engineered cool downs, engineered winter, engineered snowstorms. They'll find multiple maps where, for your information too, Patrick, the eastern U.S. is relentlessly exposed to chemically engineered cool downs. Why? To continue to polarize that population into believing there's nothing wrong with the global climate. And if I could back up to Ehrlichman, insect populations, Patrick, are down globally, depending on the study, 80 to 90%. No insects, no people. 80 to 90% decline. Not sure if you're aware of that. And when you say it's not given to man to know the future, I would argue that if we have a sense of reason and we're going 100 miles an hour, 10 feet from impact into a concrete wall, we have some idea of what's going to happen. And I would argue that's exactly the path we're on. And I would encourage people to look for hard statistical data, which we provide at geoengineeringwatch.org. Not our opinion, not what we want to believe, not what we wish was so, but hard statistical data. Again, tree populations crashing, insect populations, terrestrial and aquatic crashing, plankton crashing. Any one of those scenarios is enough to trigger total global extinction, and it is happening right now. So, again, I hope, Patrick, and again, we agree on the criminality of the governments. I'm just asking you to consider that there are very real existential threats that if we ignore, that's exactly what the power structure will want us to parrot, and those who deny there's anything wrong with the environment or the climate are parroting exactly what the power structure wants them to parrot. I'm asking you to consider that.
We have 1 minute, Patrick.
Well, I don't have much to add to this. I came into this discussion as one who studied globalization for decades. If I have a line in the sand, it's with the process and the idea of globalization and the people who bring it to us. They're all wrapped up in this. They're all complicit. The United Nations agenda that is trying to impress throughout the world, they're trying to flip our economic system altogether into sustainable development. And Dane, it sounds to me like you'd be quite a supporter of sustainable development, by the way.
I'm a supporter of a planet that supports life, Patrick, and the delusion that we can continue business as usual and be on the planet much longer is simply not reality. So I'm in support of a planet that continues to support life, and that's my bottom line.
Okay, then that basically would be the sustainable development argument.
There is no, that's an oxymoron. You can't sustainably develop on a finite planet with finite resource, so I'm not for that. And so please don't take one thing and make it into another. I'm simply saying if the planet ceases to support life, that's the bottom line, and that's the track we're on, statistically, mathematically, verifiably.
Okay, well, that's basically what the United Nations says, too. So I guess, for whatever reason you're in that position, that kind of goes along with it.
Just asking for facts, Patrick. I'm just asking you to cite facts and not opinion and not ideology.
Well, there you go. It is an ideological battle in the end of it. Whether you
not from my side.
Look at it that way or not. Well,
not from my side. I'm citing facts. I'm citing statistics and facts, and I'm asking you to please come up with some of the same so that you would have a position for your conclusions and not base them on ideology.
Okay. Well, we'll agree to disagree on that for now.
Okay, and that's a very interesting place because to end, because this is. It seemed to be kind of unraveling a little bit here. But, Patrick, I want to thank you for being on this In Other News special on with Dane Wigington. I really appreciate that you had the courage to do this live on the air. And
my pleasure.
Well, Patrick Wood is a leading and critical expert on sustainable development, green economy, agendas 21 and 2030, and the history of technocracy. Patrick, thank you so much for being on In Other News.
You bet, Jeff.